So, for over 3 years, the world has been living under the shadow of US sanctions. Now, we have seen what happened to Russia. Assets were confiscated and used without permission. Russian companies were also kicked out of the SWIFT system, and that meant they couldn't do business with the majority of the Western world. The US weaponized the dollar architecture against Putin, but now Trump is going to go one step further. He's weaponizing the US consumer market like never before. And now every country is paying attention again. The US has threatened the world with secondary tariffs. It's a new type of trade weapon that forces countries to listen to the US or get punished. Now, this is a new type of sanction that could easily spiral out of control. Trump might get what he wants, but it ultimately undermines trade with the US. It reminds the world of US overreach once again. Trump is out to punish Venezuela with secondary tariffs. Any country that purchases oil or gas from Venezuela will be forced to pay a tariff of 25% to the United States on any trade they do with our country. So if any nation dares to buy oil from Maduro's economy, their exports will be hit with additional tariff. This will be coming on April the 2nd together with the rest of the tariffs. It's really unclear whether Trump wants to tax the seller or buyer, but either way it's bad news for countries looking to sell into the US. It's common knowledge that the US doesn't support Maduro's regime. The Trump White House is actively supporting a change of government. And the strategy here is to isolate Venezuela from the world by cutting away their economy. It's been an objective of US foreign policy for a very long time. Now, Venezuela's economy has been in shambles for many years. Since 2014, they have suffered a recession for 7 long years, and in 2020, their economy contracted by a record 30%. Under the Biden administration, their economy was supposed to be given sanctions relief. The United States wanted democratic reforms, but that never happened, so the country is still under heavy sanctions by the US government. Now, chief of which are the oil punishments. PDVSA, which is the country's national oil company, can't do business with US companies, so revenues have already been collapsing. However, Trump wants to ramp up the pain. Now, these secondary tariffs on Maduro's oil exports are going to crush the entire economy. And if there's ever a time to use the word brutal, this will be it. Oil accounts for 80% of the country's exports. In fact, it contributes 17% of GDP. By threatening tariffs to buyers of Venezuelan oil, Trump wants to reduce their exports to zero. It would crush the entire country's economy and send it back to the Stone Age. Now, the US has enormous leverage over Venezuela's economy. While they were busy punishing the country for years, an American oil giant has been pumping out oil in the country. Through multiple joint ventures, Chevron has been producing and exporting Maduro's oil from the ground to the world. Production has been increasing since 2023, and we are back to nearly a 250,000 barrels a day. Here's the catch: the revenue generated in dollars stays within the country and is untouchable by the government. Now, due to the sanctions, Chevron can't sell the oil back to the US directly, so they are in control of oil exports to the world. Now, Trump could always remove the waiver and force Chevron to shut down operations, or his secondary tariffs could simply make oil demand vanish. Now, besides collapsing Maduro's economy, these secondary sanctions will hurt his oil customers. We have major economies all over the world actively buying Venezuelan oil because the prices are just too fantastic, and besides, Chevron was busy selling the barrels. The blow to Beijing won't be crippling, but it is still very significant. China buys more than 40% of the oil exports. Chinese refineries are already facing thin margins because of intense competition. In some refineries, they depend heavily on this cheap oil import, and the discounts can be as steep as 20% or more. The volumes can make up as much as a fifth of refiner feedstocks, so many small teapot refineries could collapse and even shut down operations if the US goes ahead with this. Obviously, China isn't happy about this situation. They are already the target of Trump's trade war and has been escalating almost every month. Venezuela's oil might comprise a small amount of China's oil imports, but we cannot ignore the symbolism. If the ultimate goal is to contain China's economy, then there's a secondary benefit in cutting away Venezuela's oil exports. You still deal a big blow to Chinese industries. A few months ago, the US threatened to cut away Iran's oil exports to the world. Besson, the head of the US Treasury, wants to cut their exports down by a stunning 90%. But here's the big problem. Guess who's also the biggest buyer of Iranian oil? It's China. They account for 90% of sales. If you throw this in with China's volumes from Venezuela, they are very substantial. In total, China bought over 1.6 million barrels a day from these two countries. It's more than their sensitive oil imports from Russia. Now, by threatening to cut away Iran and Venezuelan exports, Besson is also indirectly threatening China's industrial economy. Beijing's already facing a litany of trade tariffs. The US is also trying to recruit Mexico and Canada to put up trade barriers against China. So Chinese industries have to fire on all cylinders to bring down the price of energy. And this move by Trump is going to hurt relations with China that are already at rock bottom levels. There's a reason why this move is just so deadly. Unlike previous rounds of financial sanctions, this punishment is 100% enforceable. Now, if you cut away a country from the dollar system, there are still many workarounds possible. You can trade in bilateral currencies and use other payment systems like China's SIPs. But secondary tariffs can be enforced by the United States directly. They just need to raise the tariff levels for imports coming into the country, which is a very simple thing to do at customs.
That you announced earlier today, sir.
Yes.
You said it's 25% for any country that does business
That's right.
with Venezuela.
If they buy their oil from Venezuela, they have to pay a 25% tariff to do business with the United
Is
States.
that on top of existing tariffs? So, for example, China buys a
Yes,
lot of
that
oil.
would be on top of it for existing.
45%
That would
tariffs
mean,
on China
yep,
next week.
that's on top of existing tariffs, yes.
And so also next week, April 2nd, as you said, Liberation Day. Is that going to be sector tariffs as well as reciprocal tariffs?
It's going to be everything.
So China already faces an additional tariff of 20% since March. If they continue to import the sanctioned oil, they will face a 25% tariff on top of the additional 20%, which brings the total to 45%, which is absolutely crazy. And knowing Donald Trump, there's a good chance he will just throw caution to the wind and enforce it. And beyond China, other countries will also get hammered. While the US was number 2, India and Spain were third and fourth. These economies bought at least 60,000 barrels a day of Venezuelan oil and they are now on a hit list. It's very likely these countries will relent and they'll stop buying the oil. Facing an additional 25% tariff to the US would be unthinkable. Trump is using a bazooka to hammer in a nail, and many countries just can't fight back. But weaponizing your consumer market like this will eventually backfire. Maybe not today, but definitely tomorrow. You can't hold the world hostage for every single foreign policy outcome you want. Sooner or later, they will break away because US sanctions are getting really tiresome. Now, in Trump's first term, he imposed almost 4,000 new sanctions. Biden took it to the next level, especially during the Russia Ukraine war. He imposed over 8,000 sanctions on countries, entities, and individuals. Trump's new sanction tool is really a dangerous one and introduces a slippery slope for countries. If they comply with this, who knows how much further the US market can be weaponized? The US economy is being used by the global hegemon to force a favorable outcome in geopolitics. Now, what if tomorrow the US tells countries not to buy Chinese EVs or get slapped with a tariff? Or maybe things break down with Russia and the same trick is now being used on Russian oil. Now, this chart is crazy. The US by far has the most tariffs on the global economy. This list is from 2022 and it shows us which country has imposed the most tariffs on imports. The US has imposed nearly 5,000 tariffs even before Trump took office. China is the largest trading nation in the world, but they have less than 800 sanctions on everyone else. Hong Kong, which is part of China, has zero tariffs on imports. They have a free trade policy, and that's why it's such a big trading hub in Asia Pacific today. The fewer tariffs you have imposed, the stronger your economy is. It's really a sign of how competitive you really are. Think of how much further this can be weaponized. It might be Venezuela today, it could be Saudi Arabia tomorrow. And if there's any lesson to be learned in 2025, is that relations are always temporary. Mexico, Canada, and the EU, they were all allies and friends of the United States, but Trump's tariff war doesn't discriminate. And this will lead to more countries trading outside the United States. It's really predictable what would happen if Trump moves ahead in April with his trade war. He will raise prices in the United States to an alarming degree, and yes, it will be US importers that will bear the brunt of the tariffs. Now, just look at US import dependence on Mexico and Canada alone. These countries supply almost 30% of total US imports. Some states, including North Dakota, import 71% of everything from Mexico and Canada. For Montana, it's over 90%. Even Texas is nearly 50%. And just go through the list and you realize how badly the trade war will backfire. Prices across the board will fly higher, and it will be the US that will suffer the most. Now, tariffs are a very fun tool to threaten countries with, but the US is just as exposed to the effects, and in this case, it will be higher prices. But is there another agenda to punish the oil exports? It can't just be about regime change in Venezuela, right? Well, during his hearing with Congress, Besson exposed the truth when he talked about Iranian oil, and this might just be the real plan behind the scenes.
I would view that as we can raise U.S. production, we would squeeze down the bad actors, especially Iran. So through sanctions policy, I believe that we can, again, as I like to say, make Iran poor again. Not the Iranian people, the Iranian government. And then at the same time, they have our domestic producers push that up with the highest energy standards in the world.
So think about it, if countries like Iran and Venezuela drop their production to zero, the US can swoop in and raise their own oil exports. US oil companies today face a big problem with increasing production. Oil prices needs to stay high for them to stay profitable. Now, pumping out more oil increases the global supply and depresses prices. Besides cutting down the federal deficit, Besson also wants to raise US oil production by 3 million barrels a day. Besides drilling for more oil, there's another devious way to do it. You stop exports from countries like Iran and replace the supply with your own, and this way, US producers can pump and sell more oil without suffering a drop in price. So will Trump enforce this? Most likely he would. It's a double win for him. He gets to look strong while also benefiting big oil in the United States. And once again, these are secondary sanctions, secondary tariffs. Unlike Biden's financial punishments, there's no dodging additional tariffs, especially if it's across the board. There's simply no way to escape this. But as always, let me know what you think. Will Trump impose his oil sanctions? And how will China respond to this? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.